So this is the last video that I'm recording, but it's the first video that you were going to see. I didn't record the first, or I didn't document the first part of the procedure for doing this dome. But what I did was I got, I think it was 22 inches of square of plywood, 3/4 inch plywood, glued them together, and so I had that square. Then I roughly cut it in a circle, and then I screwed the circle, this, to the workbench. So I just came up from underneath and just made sure they didn't pop out. And so from there, what I did was I just used a chisel and then a jack plane just to take off evenly the plywood, and plywood is very good for this because it's got the layers, so the layers give a really easy visual representation of the transition and if it's even or not. And when I bought my radius dish, I got these 15-foot radius, and I got another one for the top. But I was just using that to roughly come in. So when I first started, I just looked at that, which is about probably a little bit over 1/4 of an inch. And I said, okay, I've got to take off 1/4 of an inch at least on around the entire perimeter of the circle. And so I just did that roughly, and then started to plane outwards until I got it pretty good. Actually, I got it to probably about, I'd say 90% there. And then this was still bolted to the workbench. And then I got the actual radius dish. This is a 15-foot radius dish, which I do back braces on and backs. I had this radius dish on top of this, and I was trying to sand it. So I was trying to sand the plywood like this, and the plywood's just too hard. It's way too difficult. So I ended up using this stuff, and the following videos will lay that out in more detail. But I just thought I'd throw in another video at the beginning just to show what I did to make the substrate. And the trick is to get the substrate as good as possible, as close as possible. And it's actually pretty easy if you've got one of these. It's you just keep checking and just keep planing. This is like Home Depot plywood or Lowe's plywood, which has got, it's pretty big transitions. They're, I don't know, they're like 1/8 of an inch big. The better plywood is Baltic birch plywood, and I'll show you why. 1 sec. Oh, actually, I've got some here. Baltic birch plywood has much finer transitions, or much finer layers, thinner layers. So this is actually 3 layers. This is a workbench dog thing, whatever you call them, and you can see the size difference. So if you use this just at least for the top cap, you'll be able to get a much more even visual transition. Well, the layers will allow you to see visually much more easily, because there'll be more lines to use for reference. The wide Home Depot plywood, you know, each line was kind of between 1 inch and 2 inches away from each other, and it's just, they were too far apart to gauge the transition. So that is about all I can say, I think. Bolting this to the workbench was really helpful, and this wouldn't, it's easier to have this facing down, well, not facing down, it's facing up technically, but having this below the radius dish and working the radius dish like this. Otherwise you have to flip everything and put that down and put this here if this was on top. It's much easier to have this where it is, sand it, put this down and check it. It just saves a step. So that's my preliminary video. Enjoy the rest of it. Hello, welcome to Beau Hannam Guitars. I wanted to talk to you about something a little bit different for me, and that is radius dishes. And so this is a normal radius dish for a back, and it's 15 foot in radius. So you can see that is radius, and that dishes this way, right? So I want to start pressing a few backs, laminating a few backs. And to do that, you need to, in that dish that I just had, you need to put an outer layer, then a core with the grain going at a right angle to the outside, and then you need an inner. The inner doesn't have to be the same species as the outer, but just for the sake of this demonstration, it is. This is for the Carter guitar, by the way. So the end result looks like this. Sort of a 3 sandwich, and this holds its shape really nicely. Actually, it holds it perfectly with epoxy. Most people don't put braces on a laminated back, but I just think a back that doesn't have braces on it just looks a bit weird, so I put that brace on there. So to press those backs, that ukulele back I did a slightly different way, but for a guitar back I need something larger. I needed a male side to go with the dish, which, for lack of a better word, I'll call the female side. So female, and then the dish, or the sort of dome, goes like that. So this is domed. So the dish was this side, and the dome is this side, or this way. So to laminate the guitar back, and you can do this for ukes as well obviously, I needed a dome that would fit inside the radius dish. So the dome is here, we go there, or rather the radius is here. You put a back onto there and you press this and it's a perfect fit. So what I did or tried to do was to get 2-ply 3/4 inch plywood, so 1.5 inches thick all up, and then I got a chisel and a hand plane, jack plane, and I just radiused this down reasonably well, and then I used that radius dish to drive the bus and grind it in to a perfect kind of shape. That didn't work. It's just too difficult. You just have too many high and low spots. I didn't do a good enough job in planing it. But what I realized was I could just cover that surface with a putty, like a wood putty, and that dusts or sands to dust really nicely. It's kind of like what you put on a drywall. So I put on the first coat and I started to sand back into the wood here, and I've got these low spots, so I stopped and went and bought some more. So I'm just going to fill in these little low spots, pack it out a bit, and then when this dries it should sand out nicely. At the moment the areas which are sanded really beautifully, like it's a perfect fit. So I got this stuff. I'm not sure, I didn't realize it was so pink, but I don't mind. And I'm just gonna lob it on, and because it sands so easily, I'm just gonna put it on pretty thick. Especially on the edges, like here, the first sort of inch, I seem to have planed the very edges a bit too hard, so then I'm just kind of curving this a little bit, so when I go around it's pretty nice. And I'm going to redo the areas which are already touched, just to make it even. So obviously some smart ass is going to say, why don't you use a CNC? Yes, I could have used a CNC, but I don't have a fucking CNC, so I'm not using one. You can also buy these dishes, well, you can buy a radius dish for about $100, and I think, don't try and, well, people do, but I wouldn't try and make a radius dish. Just too hard. And it's pretty crappy work. Like, it's just not fun to try and make one of these. I can make a dome like this because I can use the existing pre-bought radius dish to grind it, but apart from that I'm not going to try and make an actual radius dish, because you don't want to mess around with having a wonky radius dish. That's probably good. Okay, so that's got another coat on of this stuff. It has a dry time indicator, so that's good. So I'm just going to wait for that to dry, then re-sand it with the radius dish, see where we are. I might have to do this, 2, maybe 3 times, but after that I'm going to seal it with just some tabletop sealer, and then I'll have a really nice strong mating surface to go with my radius dish that I can laminate with. Probably the better way to do this, I'm not sure how hard this dries and how much pressure I can put on this, or this stuff, before it cracks. But I did look at, laminating, or not laminating, but casting resins and stuff like that. They're pretty expensive, and they're kind of toxic, I suppose. I did think about laying down the radius dish and pouring resin, obviously sealing it with something, and then pouring resin into it and then letting that set, and that would have been a perfect dome, but that would have needed sanding as well. I'm not sure what method is best, or what kind of surface like this is best or hardest. But after I sand all this, there's actually not going to be very much of this on here, because I sanded and planed the actual plywood pretty close, within about, I'd say I got it about 90% done, and it was just these little high spots that I couldn't sand down. So yeah, I think this is going to work out well, and I'll let you know. Hello. So this stuff has dried, and it goes on really pink, dries white. I may not have mentioned that. So you might be able to see the, when you put it on, it goes on a bit uneven. So we're going to start radiusing it with the 15-foot radiusing dish. So you can see how much this powders off. And you could even do some lead pencil lines, which I might do just for the sake of this demo. So the powdering process, it sort of gums up the dish, so you just have to get rid of the gummed up areas on the sanding dish, on the radiusing dish. You have to use your imagination for that. So just keep going little by little. But as you can see, this stuff sands just so much easier than trying to get the actual wood or plywood to sand completely perfectly on this radiusing dish. So I'm really glad I thought of this. And this should come out perfect, but if not, I'll just add a bit more of the spack filler stuff, Bondo, whatever it's called. And yeah, it should be good. So it's touching the wood here. So I'll just make sure I favour this side a little bit when I'm sanding from now on. This radius dish, it might have it might be very slightly warped, so it's actually best to do it like this. But also add a bit more pressure on this side. Not enough to change the radius of this dome, but just enough to make it good. This is almost perfect. I'm not so worried about this, the very edge, because I'm not actually going to use that. For instance, this is a dreadnought size, and I'm about pretty close to an inch in from the edge, which is good. There's a little bit of pock marking here and there. Tiny bit of lead pencil still there. If I wanted to, I could just build this up a little bit more, just the edge here, with more of this. But it's looking pretty good. There's a little bit to go there. You can also see the radius dishes getting clogged up quite evenly over the whole surface. So that's a good sign. So again, this has been so far a really good idea. The only sort of unknown that's still apparent to me is when I use this as a press, if this stuff will crack or not. Not sure. But by the time I sand all this, it's really thin, if not like nothing. So this stuff's actually not the wood, sorry, it's the wood putty, which is the first layer that I put on. So you can see this is perfect dome. I'm going to hit this side a tiny bit and then call it done. I'm putting a bit more pressure on this side. Just a little bit. Okay, that's done. Luckily this dust is kind of a heavy dust, so it's not really, when I'm using this brush, it kind of doesn't get airborne that much. It just falls, which is good for your health because this isn't that great to breathe in. So you can see how little of the white second layer is there. That's back to wood, but it is really even. Then there's just a little bit here, which is where I would expect it to be, the second layer of this stuff. This beige is the wood putty, and then there's just, I can see wood grain here, so the middle, yeah, that's really good. And you can see so that's a 15-foot radius, and there's no light shining under that. So that's really good. So this is where it's back to wood. And then, you know, it's all filled in with the wood putty, and then the deeper parts were, like these chips and stuff, were filled in with this second layer that I put on. But now I've done this and I've kind of worked out the small problems. If you just put on a slightly thicker coat of this, it would just be much easier. This part here and this part here, and I think there was a few more over here, they were knots in the plywood, and the knots were just, they were really hard to plane flat. It sort of just wasn't happening, so it just was easier to chisel them out, just pop them out, and then just fill them in. It was super easy. Just much easier to do that than sharpening the chisel and, sharpening the plane and trying to get it all nice. So I'll show you what I'm going to do next. Okay, so once you've got this all nice and perfect, you need to seal it with something, and you have to get the dust off first, which is kind of hard because you brush it off and then that creates a little more dust, but you know, that's all right. So I've got two options just on hand, this and this. This is what I covered my kitchen table with, or dining room table with, so I'm going to keep that. This is like an old thing, old tin, which I'm trying to get rid of, so I'm going to use that. And this is what I cover like jigs with and things like that. I think it's so old it's kind of turned into kind of honey almost, but it's still going to go off. And I might try and hit the sides of this jig as well. So after this dries, I'll probably just give it a quick swipe with the radius dish again, but it's mostly just to seal and keep nice this wood putty surface. Hardens it up a bit. So I mentioned before my only concern was that this putty, even though it's really thin, super thin, like see-through thin, and that it's see-through thin shows you how close I got just with the plane and shaping just the raw plywood. Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is going to crack under the pressure of the clamps and stuff, but I'm going to be using a piece of foam to slightly even out the inconsistencies in the clamping pressure. And that will help with any possible cracking issues as well. So there's going to be streaks in this, but the streaks are so small it's not going to interfere with the radius. Not really pushing down, I'm just kind of brushing this over the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and do the sides, or a part of the side. This dish is actually, I screwed it to my bench so it stayed put when I was sanding it. So I can't really get to about half of it. Doesn't matter, I'm just going to do it. I can scrape back my workbench. And so this is kind of filthy, it's got dust in it, but you know, it doesn't matter. Some people are really careful about their workbench and not getting any glue in it, and you know, being kind of 18th century about it all, but I'm always getting glue and stuff on my workbench, and I just scrape it off and it's just totally fine. So I'm about 95% confident this is going to work perfectly. If it doesn't, and this cracks beyond repair, what I'll do, I'll chip off all the wood putty and stuff and basically redo the same thing but in resin, which is very hard, and it's going to be a bit harder to sand it into a nice dome, but at least I know it will be hard and not crack. But as long as the clamping pressure doesn't have hot spots, it's going to be fine. So just get this polyurethane sealer, streak free or blob free, and call it a day. Okay, that's fine. So this is the messy thing. Glove. Clean. So I'll show you what the streaks look like, if I can kind of capture any. Sort of see there. And they're not large enough to cause any problems. When this dries, so tomorrow I'll come in and just sand those little streaks back with some 220 and a block, and that'll be fine. I won't use the radius dish because that's got 80 grit sandpaper on it. So it's ugly, but who cares? It's going to do its job. That's all I care about. So that's how I made a laminating dome. Okay, so I epoxied up the guitar back yesterday and used the dome for the first time. I didn't do any test kind of glue ups to see if the dome works perfectly or anything, because I like to live on the edge. I also like to use every go bar I've got, so it takes a second to get them all off. But I wanted to show you this part so you can see how I glued it up. So the dome, looks good. Thin foam. This is a drawer liner that you get from like an auto parts store or something. Wax paper. So I used West Systems epoxy for this, and then I used wood dust, just ebony wood dust, which I always have on hand, to thicken it up a little bit, just because West Systems is pretty thin. Actually, it's really thin, and it can do with a little bit of thickening up. You can use the micro balloons, I think they call it, or the silica thickening stuff, but it's bad to breathe in that stuff, and it costs like $30 and wood dust is free. So So this feels good. And I can just feel that this is the radius is in this. I'll just show you something. So I put a piece of masking tape all the way up, and that just becomes a handy center line. Then you can see the center line on the first piece of wood, then the cedar, and then this. And the low about line all matches up, and you know, the offcuts or anything outside the line I didn't bother gluing out because there's no point. So I will take this out. Beautiful. And that has kept the radius really nicely, which you might not be able to see. Kind of see it. What I'm going to do, oh, you'll be able to see it this way. What I'll do, I'll cut this guitar shape out and then come back with a radius template, and you will see. Okay, so I've cut out the guitar shape, and do you think it went well? Or do you think I screwed everything up? So this is the outside, 15 foot. Perfect. And inside, perfect. There's a tiny bit of spring back on the ends, but that just doesn't matter. Yeah, there's a tiny bit of spring back, but it's like I'm putting just the tiniest amount of pressure on that, and it closes up. And you know, it doesn't matter if it's actually a perfect 15 foot. 15.2 foot is fine. So complete success, which is good. Just make sure you use epoxy, and make sure you use epoxy. Before I continue, epoxy has no water in it, so it doesn't. When you introduce water into such a large surface, it will warp and spring back and do funny things. If you use epoxy, it doesn't do that, or far less chance of doing that. And use some thin foam to do it. Other people I've seen use carpet underlay for veneering. I've not bothered to look at that because the draw liner was perfect, and it's actually that roll that I bought, it just laid out and it was exactly like I couldn't have cut it to a more perfect size. Yeah, so I'm gonna make that size dome is good for guitars. I'm gonna make another one for ukes and I'll put a birch ply cap on the top just so I can have the finer grain, which will show up the circular pattern when I plane it. Just be a bit easier to do. But yes, that's good. I'm glad it worked. This is the Carter guitar. So this wood was planted on former US President Carter, Jimmy Carter's farm in Georgia, I think. It's pronounced Paulownia, I think. Paul, OWNIA, and it's got the highest strength to weight ratio of any wood in the world. But it is very light, so this, even though this is about 1/4 of an inch thick, yeah, it's a touch over 1/4 of an inch. It's actually really light, and it sands really easily. So, and by easily I mean the wood disappears very quickly with like 180 grit on a random orbital sander. So, you know, some of this and some of this will be coming off during the sanding process, so I made it a bit thicker than, you know, final thickness. Yeah, this guitar and the matching ukulele will be auctioned off come November, and hopefully will fetch a nice price. Not for me, I don't get any money from this. It all goes to, all the proceeds will be going to, I'm not exactly sure where, but to people and or things that need it. So yeah, it's a worthwhile cause and worthy of my time. So I hope you learned something with making the dome. It's a pretty long video, I know, but I enjoyed making it. Thank you very much, and if you like these sort of videos, do subscribe. Cheers, bye.